Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your in-depth look at how news from around the world is affecting Taiwan. I'm Hami Okan. The US, Japan, and Australia are conducting combined military exercises in the South China Sea, with an emphasis on how to integrate their militaries. On this just one occasion in a series of joint military drills, since Tokyo hiked its defense budget by more than 25%, and some say this is a response to a more assertive China within the Indo-Pacific. But how can Japan contribute to Indo-Pacific security? To answer this question, I spoke to Alessio Patalano. He's Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia at King's College London, where we first zoom in on the latest challenges of Japan's defense strategy.
I think the first point to make is about Article 9 and the mentioning that you did there about the pacifist sort of aura around the Japanese defense posture. Because Article 9 was always designed to signal, in many ways, a fundamental shift away from what had been during World War II, and in the run-up in the 1930s, in the run-up to World War II, a much more aggressive foreign policy and indeed a military policy in Japan. However, it was always designed to be very much circumstantial. It was very much about, Japan does not aspire to possess war-making capabilities, but at the same time, what it is your war-making capability, to what extent you define, how do you define when you are presenting a threat to others? So regional context always mattered. And in a way it created a false dichotomy between a pacifist Japan and a more assertive Japan. The thing is, if you look at the developments of the last 20 years, they are couched into a much longer term trajectory that starts already in the second part of the Cold War, whereby in Japan there was a serious conversation, a serious debate about the fact that the United States global commitment would demand Japan to do a much greater efforts on its own terms.
And as we are seeing a much more assertive Japan, across the East China Sea, we've seen China ramp up its military modernization. That isn't new. We've seen that for a couple of decades. But why is Japan making these changes to be more assertive right now?
So I would perhaps use a slightly different vocabulary here, because more than assertive is active, right? And Prime Minister Abe, the late Prime Minister Abe, was very clear about the fact that when he talked in the early 2010 about Japan's being back, it really sort of couched the idea of a Japan that is back in terms of being an active player in the security landscape that was fast evolving. And that evolution, of course, the pace of that transformation was set by, of course, China to a large extent, but also North Korea. And the requirements of greater instability due to the non-state challenges that existed internationally.
But when we talk about Japan in that space, like you said, maritime reigns supreme in this area to project your power. But with Japan being more active, like you said, is there anything specific in terms of that capability landscape? Because we do hear news reports about Japan acquiring more counter-strike capabilities, or whether it be submarines or land attack cruise missiles, or these sort of capabilities. Is this the direction that Japan is taking to be more active?
As you say, the Indo-Pacific, we call it the Indo-Pacific because it's the convergence of two oceans, but at heart it means that the core capabilities that will define the battle space, if it comes to that, are capabilities that are relevant in terms of conducting operations in a maritime-led domain, one in which the sea, and skies and space are all integrated with each other. So in that context, Japan already made really significant investments in undersea capabilities, most notably in the realm of submarines. And Japan maintained the most advanced conventionally powered submarine fleet already in the early 1990s. Now, thinking about counter-strike, that adds an extra layer of deterrence from the possibility of placing, that's a big debate at the moment in Japan, land strike missiles on board of their submarines, giving time to think about anyone wanted to use missile capabilities against Japan in the first instance. But the other two areas, which I think are very important, are investment into space in order to enhance the ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting capabilities. This has been very clear in the latest national security strategy, and in pursuing a mix of longer range standoff capabilities that push the boundaries of territorial defense of the Japanese archipelago further out, closer to a potential competitor's shores.
And it's really interesting because Japan is in a unique position, stuck between China, North Korea. We've seen last week Russian and Chinese ships transit through those, whether it be the Okinawa Islands or between the islands of Japan to go back to port. And because of Japan's unique position, the United States relies on Japan for forward basing and whatnot. And there has been officials that have said that allies are worth much more than missiles. Given this kind of geopolitical or the location that Japan is in, how can that help in sort of contributing to regional security, the fact that the United States is so far away?
So I think you're touching upon two very important points. One is the sort of the geographic position that Japan has that is strategically very important, and historically that's always been the case. Now, whether it is the bases in Okinawa or other bases across Japan, the function of a lot of the US forces in Japan, particularly over the last 3 to 4 decades, has always been about the United States' capacity to project power, hard power, closer into the Western Pacific, more than just the defense of Japan and the Japanese islands. So there is this element of physicality, right? Japan's geography lends itself to reinforce the United States as a Western Pacific power. On the other hand, there is another element of this story that you are sort of referring to, and that is how to make this relationship really a bedrock, a pillar of regional stability, and makes more than just, oh, we're here to defend Japan. And in that sense, the decade in which the late Prime Minister Abe really contributed to reshape Japanese security was essential for the United States and Japan to have a conversation about what kind of Japan both would be comfortable seeing, not just in support of the United States, but also an active Japan that shapes regional security in order to maintain a stable environment.
When you talk about regional neighbors, right next to us, South Korea, and in this Camp David, we saw the first dedicated Trilateral summit to these three countries. And it's been quite a time coming because of the political situation between South Korea and Japan. But seeing this kind of threat from North Korea, Biden went on the record saying that it's all about information sharing and making sure that countries understand what threat and can respond to that threat. And then shortly after, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said that they need to make sure that they don't have any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in cooperation with the United States and Korea to make sure that doesn't happen. What do you make of the Camp David summit in the sense of, are there any significant developments that we're seeing that go with that narrative that you're discussing about this trend in Asia?
The first and most important signal out of Camp David is that now we have a very different communication about where Japan and South Korea are with each other. And what does that mean in terms of the regional security picture? So that's a really important point, because for a long time there has been real significant tensions between these two actors. So the first sort of important thing to take away from this Camp David summit is the optics of it, which leads, however, to the second, I think, really significant point, that is about something that too often we tend to underestimate and undervalue. The better way to understand where the future is going and what kind of challenges to it are coming from, right, is to have a really robust relationship. Like everything else in life, really, relationships are at the heart of everything we do. And so developing the network, connectivity among these three actors so that we may not agree about how to get about a particular problem, but we will make sure that we understand each other about the problem. And I think this is absolutely essential if you think about, if not integrating your responses, but certainly making sure that there is a clear correlation and cooperation in the way you respond to a crisis. So the second point is about making a political commitment to ensuring that that is happening. And to me, even just these two observations are essential in what to take away from what happened at Camp David.
And it's when you talk about cooperation, we're seeing Japan, I think this week they're conducting exercises with Australia and the United States in the South China Sea. That scope of capabilities and the operational landscape in which it can operate. And when we look at Australia, that seems to be the dominant player in that area of the Indo-Pacific. How does Australia then kind of in the sense of matching Japan's energy, for lack of a better word, but go with that trend of making sure that there is a regional security apparatus, but also in communication with the United States that supports all these allies?
So there's 2 points, and let me sort of add, I think you can be even bolder than that, because when it comes to Japan, and to an extent also Australia, they've been reaching out to NATO, they've been reaching out to European counterparts. So this idea that these medium powers matter is particularly powerful in relation to something else, that is Indo-Pacific stability. It's not just a matter of Indo-Pacific actors. It's something that interests international stability, and in turn, what happens elsewhere also has overbearing in this part of the world. So for example, Australia's and Japan interest and behavior in regards to Ukraine has been very significant because, of course, a violation of sovereignty, a violation of status quo, that is a fundamental core principle that in this part of the world, countries like Japan and Australia have been talking about for a long time. It would have been absolutely odd not to do anything or say anything about it when it came to someone else this happening. And so in this respect, we've seen that Australia has been very active and important to the United States, to Japan, and together with Japan to create a sense of connectivity that certainly places ASEAN at the center. And if you're Australia, that is a really important point to make. And by the way, it's a point also that at Camp David, Japan, South Korea, and the United States have made.
And when you talk about connectivity, I like to bring this to Taiwan because Taiwan is in a bit of a unique position that the fact that because of its political situation, can't officially take part in these joint military exchanges. However, some of these drills are happening in an unofficial framework. The closest country, Japan, Yonaguni Island is about 100 kilometers away. You can see it on a clear summer day in Taiwan. Because at the end of the day, when you talk about connectivity, Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, and a possible flashpoint does bring a concern to Japan.
100%, and I think you can make this point about Japan, but I think you can make it about not just Japan, you can make it about really anyone who's interested in international security in that sense. And it starts with things such as communities of practice in the security realm. It could be universities, it could be research centers, it could be think tanks. Think about the fact that, for example, only just 5 years ago, Taiwan established the first Ministry of Defense think tank with INDSR. Now, this is a really important reality to start creating this connectivity with that softer tissue that over time will allow to better identify which exercises or activities the Taiwanese might be interested in sort of having the possibility to participate, whether it's observers or sending specialists. These kind of steps. And this is very important to suggest, perhaps, that between the sort of like, oh, there's a massive exercise like RIMPAC, and where we are today, there's so many different layers, all of which present opportunities, which I do believe countries like Japan are already starting to explore when it comes to relationship with Taiwan. And in that sense, Japan represents a really good model for many other countries who understand that in a one China policy world, the goalpost of what is the realm of the acceptable and politically possible has been moved by the PRC. And so that creates opportunity for everybody else as well in this space.
That was Alessio Patalano, Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia at King's College London. Thank you for watching Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus, please make sure to check us out on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching TaiwanPlus. Be sure to follow us on social media for more stories from Taiwan and around the world.